The Mill at Alder Brook, Episode 3, Canvas Sacks in the Grain Loft.
Tessa heard Alder Brook before she saw the mill. The water followed the lane at a distance, hidden at first by the low ground and the evening growth along the bank. Its sound came gently through the mild air, steady and familiar, growing clearer as the lane curved toward the footbridge. There was no rush in it. Water moved over the shallow bed, gathered beneath the bridge, and continued toward the mill in one long, even murmur. She walked at an easy pace, with the new ledger tucked beneath one arm. In her other hand, she carried a small work bag. It held chalk, labels, a soft brush, and the few plain things she would need to begin putting the grain loft in order. The mill came into view beyond the footbridge. Its walls still held the last warmth of the day. The windows reflected a pale stretch of evening sky, and the roof stood dark and quiet above them. Beyond the mill yard, the upper branches of the orchard were motionless. The bakehouse rested farther back, and the kitchen garden lay between the buildings in settled rows. Nothing there needed her attention tonight. Her work was inside, above the main floor, where the empty grain bins and canvas sacks had been waiting in the closed loft. Tessa crossed the footbridge. The brook sounded fuller beneath the boards. She slowed near the middle and glanced toward the mill race. The water was moving along its ordinary course, but the wheel remained at rest. There would be other evenings for following the water and other work for the wheel. Tonight, the stillness suited the mill. She continued into the yard. The ground was dry beneath her boots. She stopped outside the main door, shifted the ledger into her hand, and found the key. The lock turned without resistance. When she opened the door, the familiar scent of the mill reached her. Old timber, faint flour dust, cool stone from below, and canvas stored in dry air. She stepped inside and left the door open behind her. The main floor was dim but not dark. Evening light entered in broad, quiet shapes and rested on the boards. The machinery stood still. Without the wheel turning in the room below, every smaller sound had room to be heard. The brook beyond the wall, a slight creak from the stairs, the soft touch of her bag against her coat as she set it down. Tessa stood for a moment and listened. She had opened the resting mill earlier in the week and had already learned its quiet again. It was never complete silence. Water moved nearby. Wood settled as the day cooled. Air found narrow ways through old frames and under doors. These sounds did not ask questions. They simply marked the building as a place made from useful things, each resting until it was needed. She placed the ledger on a clear part of the work table. Then she crossed the main floor slowly, looking upward toward the grain loft. The loft would be close after a day shut against the warmth. Before she brushed a bin or sorted a sack, she would open it to the evening. Fresh air could begin the work while she brought up the tools. Tessa returned to the table and opened her bag. She checked its contents one item at a time. The brush had soft, closely set bristles. The chalk was wrapped in a small piece of cloth so it would not mark the ledger by accident. The labels were blank and tied together with string. She had also brought a clean hand cloth and a shallow wooden pan for gathering dust. Everything was there. She closed the bag loosely, took it by the handles, and climbed the stairs. The boards gave a mild sound beneath each step. One hand held the rail, polished smooth by years of use. As she rose above the main floor, the air became warmer and drier. The scent of canvas grew stronger. By the time she reached the top, she could feel the stored warmth of the loft around her face and hands. She paused on the last step. Empty wooden bins stood along one wall, their lids raised or resting back where they had been left. A group of canvas sacks occupied the open floor nearby. Some were folded. Others had loosened over time and leaned against one another in soft, uneven shapes. Flour dust lay lightly across the boards, most visible where the evening light reached it. On a beam above the bins were the old chalk marks. Tessa noticed them as she had expected to. Lines of quantities had been written there during previous harvests, close enough to the bins for easy reference. The figures were faded in places, but they were still legible. They did not suggest anything more than the ordinary record of grain once stored and used. She would copy them into the new ledger later, exactly as they appeared. For now, the room needed air. Tessa carried the bag to a clear corner and set it down. She crossed the loft, careful not to disturb the loose sacks, and opened the first window. The frame moved slowly at the beginning and then more freely. Cooler air touched her fingers. She opened the second window as well. The change was slight, but immediate. Air entered from one side of the loft and passed toward the other, easing through the room rather than pushing into it. A corner of loose canvas lifted and settled. Dust near the window rose in a pale thread, drifted a short distance and began to descend. Tessa rested her hands on the sill. From here, she could see part of the yard and the beginning of the narrow path that followed the mill race upstream toward the sluice meadow. The water itself was partly hidden, but its sound reached her clearly. Beyond the kitchen garden, the bakehouse and orchard remained in the soft evening light. She did not stay at the window long. The view was familiar, and the open loft was already cooling. Tessa turned and walked the length of the room. She did not begin cleaning yet. This first walk was only to see what was where. The bins were empty. She looked into each one without touching the interior, noting the fine dust along the bottom and the slightly heavier line gathered in the corners. None would be difficult to brush. Their wooden sides appeared dry and sound. The sacks also needed no complicated sorting. There were usable ones with firm seams, and there were several that would have to be opened and inspected before she could place them in orderly rows. Nothing suggested damage. They had simply rested where they were put down, slowly losing the shape of their folds. Near the stairs, Tessa found an open patch of floor where the boards were almost clear. She chose it as the place for the ledger table she would make later from the available work surface. The labels could remain there until the bins had been brushed. Clean grain was expected in a small delivery, and when it came, each portion would have a plain name and a plain place. There would be no need to rely on memory once the inventory was written. She crossed back to the chalk marks. The oldest-looking figures were not necessarily the earliest, and Tessa did not try to arrange them into a story. They were quantities, nothing more. Practical numbers written by working hands when the beam had been the nearest useful surface. Some stood alone. Others had short strokes beside them. All could be copied in their present order and preserved in the new ledger as earlier harvest records. She read the first line silently, then the next. There was enough light to work, but she decided not to bring the ledger upstairs until the air had moved through the loft a little longer. The pages were clean, and there was no reason to lay them down while dust still rested undisturbed on every nearby surface. Instead, she went to the sacks. The nearest one had slumped away from a folded stack. Tessa crouched and lifted it gently by the upper corners. The canvas was cool on the side that had lain against the floor and warmer where it had faced the room. It gave a low, dry rustle as she raised it. She did not shake it. Shaking would only send old flour dust into the newly moving air. She opened the sack slowly and looked along the inside seams. The stitching held. A pale trace of flour remained in the deepest crease, but the cloth itself was sound. She turned it over in her hands, checked the lower corners, and laid it flat on the clear boards near the window. With both palms, she smoothed the canvas from the middle outward. The cloth resisted a little where an old fold crossed it. Then it relaxed beneath her hands. She brought the lower part upward, folded one side toward the center, and brought the other side across it. The finished sack formed a firm rectangle. Tessa placed it beside the wall, leaving a narrow space around it so air could still pass. One sack was enough for the first evening moment. She was not yet settling into the full rhythm of the work. She was learning the loft's present state, choosing where each task would begin, and allowing the room to change from closed to open. She stood and brushed her palms against the handcloth. The light had shifted while she worked. It now entered at a lower angle, showing fine dust suspended near the bins. The particles moved slowly through the cooler air. Some passed out of sight. Most settled again on the floor, where they could be gathered when she brushed the room properly. Tessa returned to the stairhead and looked down toward the main floor. The open door below made a pale shape in the dimmer room. Air moved from the yard into the mill and upward through the loft. The arrangement was simple and sufficient. She could leave both the door and windows open while she prepared the tools, then close the lower door before the evening cooled too far. She descended and brought the ledger up in both hands. This time, when she reached the loft, the warmth no longer felt close. The room had begun to match the air outside. Canvas, timber, and empty bins kept their dry scents, but the stillness had lifted from them. Tessa placed the ledger on the clear surface near the stairs. She set the wrapped chalk beside it, then laid the blank labels in a straight stack. She opened the ledger to its first inventory page. At the top, she wrote the date. Beneath it, she made 3 plain headings: bins, sacks, and earlier quantities. There was no need to fill them yet. The headings were enough to establish the shape of the work ahead. She looked once more around the loft. The bins remained empty, ready to be brushed. The sound sack she had inspected lay in its neat fold beside the wall. The other sacks waited nearby without disorder, now that she had chosen a place for their rows. The old chalk quantities remained untouched on the beam, ready to be copied without addition or guesswork. The blank labels waited for the clean grain. Everything had a next step, and every next step was ordinary. Tessa closed the ledger gently, leaving the chalk on top to mark her place. She went to the window and drew in one slow breath of the cooler air. Below, Alder Brook continued past the mill. The wheel stayed still. Evening settled over the yard, the garden, the bakehouse, and the orchard. Inside the loft, the last warmth of the day eased from the boards. Tessa took up the soft brush. The room was aired. The inventory page was ready. She could begin with the first empty bin, working from its upper corners down, while the dust remained visible in the fading light. Tessa carried the soft brush to the first empty bin. It stood nearest the open window, where the last of the evening light reached across the wooden sides. The bin lid had already been raised and rested back against the wall. Its hinges were still. Along the upper rim, a pale line of flour dust showed where the air had not quite reached. She placed the shallow wooden pan on the floor beside her. Before brushing, Tessa leaned over the bin and looked into each corner again. The bottom was dry. The boards fitted closely enough for grain storage, and there was no old grain left beneath the fine layer of dust. What remained could be gathered with a few careful passes. She began at the upper edge. The soft bristles followed the grain of the wood. Dust loosened without rising far, slipping down the inside wall in a thin veil. Tessa moved the brush steadily from one corner to the next, overlapping each stroke so that no narrow strip was missed. The sound was quiet and regular, brush against wood. A pause as she changed her grip. Brush against wood again. Outside, Alder Brook continued beside the mill. Its low movement reached the loft through the open windows, joining the dry whisper of the bristles and the occasional mild creak of a cooling board. The wheel below remained still, and because it was still, the small sounds of the loft seemed clear without becoming sharp. Tessa worked down the first side. She didn't press hard. The brush was meant to lift what rested loosely on the boards, not scour the wood. When she reached the lower corner, she drew the dust toward the center of the bin. Then she began again at the top of the next side. Fresh air moved across the back of her hands. The stored warmth had almost gone from the room now. The bin itself still felt faintly warm where the day's heat had settled into the wood, but the rim nearest the window had cooled. Tessa noticed the difference as she steadied herself with one hand. She completed the second side, then the third and fourth. At the bottom, the gathered dust formed a light, uneven line. She brushed it into one small patch, set the brush aside, and lowered the wooden pan into the bin. With the hand cloth folded over her fingers, she guided the dust into the pan. There was very little of it. The pale covering had looked more substantial when it lay spread across the boards. Gathered together, it scarcely covered the center of the pan. Tessa lifted it out, checked the bottom of the bin once more, and wiped the upper rim with a clean part of the cloth. The first bin was ready. She left its lid raised so the evening air could continue to pass through it. Later, when the loft had cooled completely, she would close it until the clean grain arrived. Tessa looked toward the inventory page near the stairs. There was no need to write after every movement. But this was the first completed part of the work, and marking it now would make the next round simple. She carried the brush and pan to the clear surface, laid them down, and opened the ledger. Under the heading for bins, she wrote a short entry for the first one. Empty, brushed, sound. She read the 3 words once. They said everything required. The bin had held nothing when she opened it. The dust had been removed, and the wood was fit for use. She left space beside the entry for its label when the grain was placed there. Tessa set down the pencil and turned back toward the room. The next bin stood close beside the first. Its dust had gathered more heavily along the far corner, away from the window, but otherwise it appeared much the same. She could have continued immediately. Instead, she chose to alternate the tasks. One bin, then one sack. The change in movement would keep the work easy on her shoulders, and the loft would take on order in 2 places at once. She crossed to the sack she had already folded. It rested beside the wall as she had left it, a firm rectangle of sound canvas. She moved it a little farther from the open window and placed it where the finished row would begin. There was room for several folded sacks along that part of the wall without crowding the bins or narrowing the path to the stairs. The next loose sack leaned against the remaining stack. Tessa lifted it by the upper corners. The canvas unfolded under its own empty weight, making a low rasp as one layer passed over another. She held it away from herself and allowed the folds to loosen, but she did not shake it. A faint trace of flour lay along the inner seam. She turned the sack so the open end faced the light. The stitching was close and even. At the lower corners, the canvas had softened with use, though it had not worn through. She ran her fingers gently along the outside of each seam, feeling for any place where the threads had parted. The seam held from top to bottom. Tessa laid the sack flat on the boards. She used the cloth to lift the small trace of flour from the deepest crease, then smoothed the canvas with both palms. The old folds had their own memory. One side wanted to curl inward, while the lower edge remained slightly rounded from having rested against another sack. Tessa did not force it flat all at once. She pressed from the center outward, waited for the canvas to settle, and pressed again. Then she folded it. The lower part came upward. One side crossed toward the middle, followed by the other. She drew her palms over the finished rectangle, pushing out the little pocket of air held between the layers. The sack rested flat. She placed it beside the first one, aligning the folded edges. The 2 pieces of canvas were not exactly the same color. One had faded slightly along its outer face, while the other retained a deeper, warmer shade. Their size and weave were the same, and both were sound. Tessa returned to the ledger. Under sacks, she made a single mark for the one she had just inspected. The first folded sack already rested in the row. but she had checked it before opening the inventory page. She added a mark for that one as well. 2 sound sacks. The phrase was simple enough to repeat as the row grew. She picked up the brush and went to the second bin. Here, the fading daylight no longer reached the bottom clearly. Tessa brought the lamp from the clear surface near the stairs and set it on a broad ledge between the bins. Its light fell downward at an angle, warm against the cooler evening beyond the windows. In the lamplight, the flower dust became easier to see. Fine particles lay along the grain of the wood and in the meeting places between boards. Nothing was hidden by the light. It showed only the ordinary remains of storage. A pale surface waiting for a brush, a little more gathered in one corner, and several faint arcs where something had once been scooped from the bin. Tessa began at the upper rim as before. The second bin made a slightly different sound under the brush. Its sideboards were broader, and the bristles gave a longer whisper over each one. She followed the same path down, working around the inside without haste. As she brushed, a few dust particles rose into the lamplight. They drifted slowly rather than scattering. The air from the windows carried them a short distance over the bin, where they turned once and began to settle. Tessa waited before making the next stroke. When the air was clear again, she continued. There was time enough to let the dust fall. She completed the upper corners, then brushed the lower seams. The heavier line in the far corner came away easily. It was only compacted flower dust, pressed into place by its own long rest. The soft bristles loosened it a little at a time. Tessa drew everything toward the center. Again, the dust looked smaller once gathered. She lowered the pan, guided the pale line into it, and raised it out of the bin. Then she wiped the rim and looked along each side in the lamplight. The second bin was empty, brushed, and sound. She recorded it in the ledger beneath the first. The 2 entries now made the beginning of a useful list. The remaining bins could follow in their order along the wall. When labels were tied to them, Tessa would add the grain name and quantity beside each entry. Nothing would need to be remembered separately. The room and the ledger would agree. She closed the book without fastening it, and left the pencil across the page. The old chalk marks remained on the beam above her. From where she stood, she could read several of the figures. They were written in different sizes, some with firmer strokes than others. One line leaned slightly upward. Another had been fitted into the space between 2 older entries. The beam had served as a convenient record when grain was being measured and moved. Tessa did not copy the figures yet. The lamp was bright enough, and the quantities were legible, but she wanted the nearby bins cleaned first. That way she could stand beneath the beam without brushing dust around the open ledger. The marks had waited through previous harvests. Another quiet round of work would make no difference to them. She turned to the sacks again. The third sack came from the top of the loosened group. It was folded once, but not neatly, with one side hanging lower than the other. When Tessa lifted it, the canvas gave a deeper rustle than the first 2. She opened it over the clear part of the floor. The inside was clean except for a pale dusting near the bottom. She brushed that trace into the wooden pan, using short movements that kept the flower close to the cloth. Then she checked the seams. Near the opening, one thread had lifted away from the canvas. Tessa examined it between her fingers. It was only the loose end of a finished stitch, not a break in the seam. The joined edges remained firm when she pressed them gently apart. She smoothed the thread back against the cloth and continued down to the lower corners. The sack was sound. She spread it flat, pressed out the older folds, and brought the lower half upward. The canvas settled beneath her palms. One side folded inward, then the other. She placed the finished sack with the first 2. 3 rectangles now rested along the wall. Their edges made a quiet, orderly line. The row was still short, but its shape was established. Each new sack could be inspected, folded, and placed in the same direction. When the work was done, Tessa would be able to count them without opening the stack or shifting their position. She added the third mark to the ledger. Then she paused near the open window. The yard below had grown dimmer. The main door was still open, allowing the cooler air to pass through the mill. Beyond it, the kitchen garden had softened into long, low shapes. The bakehouse and orchard stood quietly beyond the rows. Nothing moved there that needed her notice. The brook kept its ordinary course. Tessa listened for a moment, resting one hand on the sill. The sound was steady beside the mill and beneath the footbridge, neither louder nor quieter than when she arrived. It filled the spaces between the nearer sounds without drawing her away from the loft. Behind her, the lamp warmed the edges of the empty bins. The first two were clean. 3 sacks had been folded and entered in the ledger. The remaining work had become clearer simply because a first round was complete. Tessa left the window and carried the shallow pan downstairs. She crossed the main floor, emptied the gathered dust into the proper waste pail, and wiped the pan clean. Then she closed the main door. The loft windows would provide enough air now, and shutting the door below would keep the mill from cooling more quickly than necessary. When she climbed the stairs again, the loft felt settled rather than close. She returned the clean pan beside the brush. The lamp flame remained low and steady. Its angled light showed a few last particles descending toward the boards between the bins and the folded sacks. Tessa did not disturb them. She opened the ledger and reviewed the entries. 2 bins brushed and sound, 3 sound sacks folded. Beneath the headings, the writing was plain and evenly spaced. There would be room for every remaining bin, every usable sack, the old quantities from the beam, and the labels for the small delivery of clean grain. She closed the ledger gently. The next stage was already prepared. She would continue along the wall, 1 bin and 1 sack at a time, until the clean surfaces and folded row reached the old chalk marks. For now, the first round held its shape. 2 bin lids remained raised to the cooling air. 3 canvas sacks rested with their edges aligned. The brush and empty pan waited together beneath the lamp. Tessa stood in the clear path between them, listening as Alder Brook moved past the resting wheel, and the last loosened dust settled softly onto the boards. Tessa opened the ledger again and set it beneath the lamp. The page held the first clear entries of the evening. 2 empty bins brushed and sound, 3 canvas sacks inspected and folded. The small list matched the part of the loft already in order. Along the wall, the 2 raised lids showed clean interiors, and the folded sacks rested with their edges aligned. She turned toward the 3rd bin. It stood directly beneath the old chalk marks. Its lid was narrower than those of the first 2, and the boards had darkened a little along the rim from years of hands lifting it. Tessa moved the lamp closer, leaving enough space between the flame and the beam above. The light reached into the bin and across the chalked wood. Before she began brushing, she read the nearest mark. It was a plain quantity followed by 2 short strokes. Another quantity stood below it, also followed by strokes, though one had faded until it was scarcely more than a pale line. Tessa looked down at the bin. The marks were close enough to have been written while someone stood exactly where she was standing. That was not surprising. The beam offered a broad, visible surface above the storage row. A miller measuring grain could write there without crossing the loft to find a page. She lifted the brush. The 3rd bin held less dust than the 2nd. Most of it lay in a narrow band along the bottom seam, where the sideboards met the floor. Tessa began at the upper corner and worked downward, following the familiar path, brush against wood. A small pause. Brush against wood again. The work had already become easy in her hands. She knew how lightly the bristles needed to pass over the boards, how far the dust would move with each stroke, and where to place the shallow pan when the last pale line had gathered at the center. She brushed all 4 sides and then the bottom. As she leaned farther into the bin, her shoulder came level with another chalk mark on the beam. This one was shorter than the others. It showed a quantity and a simple letter beside it. Tessa straightened and read it again. Then she glanced toward the first 2 bins. A similar letter had been written faintly above the first mark in the row. Another appeared near the second group of quantities, almost hidden where the grain of the beam darkened. She had noticed the figures when she first entered the loft, but not the small letters beside them. In the changing evening light, they had looked like broken ends of older chalk strokes. Under the lamp, their shape was clearer. Tessa set the brush across the rim of the third bin. She did not touch the beam. Instead, she lifted the lamp by its handle and moved it a little to the left. The light traveled along the chalk marks. Above the first bin was a small letter matching the first bin's position. Above the second was another. The third stood over the bin she was cleaning. Farther along the beam, the same simple pattern continued, each group of quantities placed roughly above one storage space. The marks were not one long list after all. They were several short lists, one for each bin. The discovery was small and entirely practical. It did not alter what the marks meant. They were still quantities from previous harvests, recorded close to the grain they had described. But now Tessa could copy them with their arrangement preserved. Rather than placing every figure beneath one general heading, she could record each group beside the bin to which it belonged. She lowered the lamp to the ledge again. The third bin still waited with its dust gathered at the bottom. Tessa finished that task before returning to the ledger. She guided the dust into the shallow pan, wiped the rim, and inspected the clean boards in the warm light. Empty, brushed, sound. She wrote the 3 words under the first 2 entries. Beside them, she left a little more room than before. The clean grain had not yet arrived, so its name and quantity would still be added later. Beyond that space, she drew a narrow column and gave it a plain heading, earlier quantities. Tessa looked back at the beam. The first group of chalk marks belonged with the first bin. The second group belonged with the second. The third stood above the bin she had just brushed. The positions made the arrangement clear, but she wanted to check it carefully before copying anything. She carried the lamp to the first bin. There were 3 quantities in that group. The highest was the easiest to read. Beneath it, the chalk had thinned across a rough patch in the wood, but the figures remained complete. The final line was smaller and stood close to the edge of the next group. Tessa read each one slowly. She returned to the ledger and copied the 3 quantities in the order they appeared, top to bottom. She did not add a year, a grain name, or a person's name. None had been written on the beam, and guessing would make the record less useful rather than more. When the 3 figures were on the page, she compared them with the marks. The first matched. The second matched. The third matched. Tessa placed a small dot beside the completed group in the ledger. The dot meant only that she had checked her copy against the beam. It did not change the old record. She moved the lamp to the second bin. This group contained 2 quantities and a pair of short strokes. The strokes might once have helped someone count measures or deliveries, but their exact use was not written. Tessa copied them as strokes. There was no need to turn them into words. She checked that group as well. Then she came to the third. Here the chalk was firmer. 4 quantities descended in a loose line, with the last fitted slightly to one side where the beam held a knot. Seen from a few steps away, the shifted figure had appeared to belong to the next group. Standing beneath it, Tessa could see that its small bin letter matched the third. She copied all 4. The page now showed what the beam had been showing all along. Each bin had its own earlier record. The quantities were ordinary remnants of previous harvests, but their placement gave them a simple order. Tessa rested the pencil across the open ledger. She looked along the remaining bins. Their interiors still held a light covering of dust, and several loose sacks remained to be inspected. The full row would take more quiet rounds. The chalk marks above it could be copied as she reached each place. There was no reason to do all of one task before touching the other. She returned to the sacks. The fourth sack lay partly beneath another, its folded mouth turned toward the wall. Tessa lifted the upper sack aside and drew the fourth into the clear space. The canvas slid across the boards with a low, dry sound. She opened it carefully. The cloth had retained a broad fold across the middle. When she spread the sack flat, the fold rose like a shallow ridge. She pressed it with one palm, moved her hand slowly toward the edge, and felt the canvas ease beneath her fingers. The seams were firm. A little flour dust remained inside one lower corner. Tessa turned the canvas so the corner rested close to the pan, then used the brush to draw the dust out. It fell without making a cloud. She inspected the stitching from the opening to the base. Nothing needed mending. The sack was sound. Tessa folded the lower half upward. She brought the first side toward the center and laid the other across it. After pressing the trapped air from between the layers, she carried the rectangle to the finished row. 4 sound sacks now rested beside the wall. She marked the fourth in the ledger, then lifted the next sack. This one opened more readily. Its canvas was softer from use, and the corners fell flat without needing to be pressed. Tessa checked the inside seams, smoothed the cloth, and folded it in the same manner. The repetition quieted the loft. Lift open, check the seams, smooth the canvas, fold in place. The fifth sack joined the fourth. Their edges were not perfectly identical, but both lay flat, and the row could be counted at a glance. Tessa added the fifth mark to the page. When she stood, she noticed that the lamp had made the old chukok clearer in another way. The light did not strike the beam evenly. It caught the raised chalk on one side and left a fine shadow on the other. Faded quantities that had seemed incomplete from the stairhead could be read when the lamp stood directly below them. She carried it to the fourth bin. The small letter above that space was faint but present. 3 quantities belonged to it. One had been written over an earlier smudge, yet the newer figures remained plain enough to copy. Tessa did not open that part of the ledger immediately. The fourth bin had not yet been brushed, and she preferred to keep the order of the room and the order of the page together. She lowered the lamp, raised the bin lid fully, and set the wooden pan beside her. The dust inside was light and even. She worked from the upper rim downward. Her strokes followed the boards, each one joining the clean strip left by the last. When a few particles rose, she stopped and let them settle. The open windows continued to bring in cool air, but the movement was gentle now. Dust drifted only a short distance before coming down again. Below the loft, the mill remained still. The brook sounded beyond the wall. Its steady passage softened the spaces between the brush strokes. Somewhere in the building, a board gave one mild creak as it cooled, then rested. Tessa gathered the dust from the fourth bin. She wiped its rim, checked the lower corners, and recorded the same 3 words in the ledger. Empty, brushed, sound. Only then did she copy the quantities above it. She preserved the smudged line as closely as she could, noting that the first mark was faint. She added nothing to explain why. Chalk softened with time. Hands brushed beams. Flour dust settled and was cleared away. The fading required no further account. Once the fourth group had been copied, Tessa compared the page with the beam from the beginning. The first bin and its 3 earlier quantities. The second bin and its 2 quantities with 2 short strokes. The third bin and its 4 quantities. The fourth bin and its 3. The first faint but readable. Everything matched. Tessa closed the ledger halfway and looked along the wall. 4 bins were now clean. 5 sacks fit in the finished row. The old chalk marks above the cleaned section had been copied without losing their arrangement. The small discovery had given the inventory a better shape, and it had resolved itself as soon as she followed the positions along the beam. There was nothing hidden in the marks. They recorded grain quantities where those quantities had once been easiest to see. Each group belonged to the bin below it. That was all, and it was enough. Tessa left the remaining chalk untouched for the next round. She returned the lamp to the ledge between the cleaned and uncleaned bins. From there, its light showed the boundary plainly. On one side, brushed wood and copied records. On the other, a few dusty interiors and chalk quantities still waiting their turn. The distinction did not feel unfinished. It felt orderly. She carried the shallow pan downstairs, emptied the small amount of gathered dust into the waste pail, and wiped the pan clean once more. When she returned, she placed it beside the soft brush. The loft had cooled further. Tessa crossed to the windows and narrowed the first one slightly. Enough air still passed through the room, but the canvas no longer stirred at its loose corners. She left the second window as it was. At the ledger, she added a brief note beneath the earlier quantities heading. Marks grouped by bin position. She read the words and nodded once. They made the copied arrangement clear without offering any story the beam itself did not contain. Then she closed the ledger. The next stage was ready and uncomplicated. She would continue from the fifth bin, brushing it before copying the quantities directly above. Between bins, she would inspect and fold the remaining sacks until the row was complete. After that, the clean grain could arrive to labels already prepared for it. For now, 4 raised lids opened over clean wood. 5 folded sacks rested in an even row. The lamp stood beneath the next group of chalk marks, and the pencil lay across the closed ledger to hold the page. Tessa took up the brush and moved it to the fifth bin. She did not begin another full round yet. She simply placed the brush on the rim, set the clean pan below, and adjusted the lamp until its light reached both the bin and the marks above it. Everything needed for the next piece of work was in place. Around her, the last disturbed flour dust descended through the angled light. The canvas sacks remained still beside the wall. Alder Brook continued past the resting wheel, and the grain loft settled into its new, clearer order. Tessa rested one hand on the rim of the fifth bin. The soft brush lay across the wood beneath her fingers. Below it, the shallow pan waited on the floor, clean after its last trip downstairs. The lamp stood on the broad ledge between the bins, and its angled light reached both the empty interior and the chalk marks on the beam above. Everything was where she had placed it. She lifted the brush and began. The fifth bin was a little deeper than the fourth. Its sideboards descended beyond the strongest part of the lamplight, though the bottom remained visible when Tessa leaned closer. A thin layer of flour dust rested there, gathered most clearly along the back seam. She started at the upper left corner. The bristles made their quiet passage over the wood. Each stroke moved downward and inward, loosening the pale dust without sending much of it into the air. Tessa followed the boards one at a time, allowing the brush to travel with the grain rather than across it. There was nothing difficult in the work. The bin was empty, the boards were dry. The dust lifted easily. She needed only to continue the same movement until each surface had been covered. Brush downward, turn the wrist. Begin again beside the clean strip. Alder Brook moved beyond the mill wall. Its steady sound entered through the narrowed window and filled the pauses between her strokes. The wheel below remained at rest, and the loft held only the brook, the brush, and the small settling sounds of old timber cooling in the evening. Tessa completed the first side and moved to the second. A few particles rose where the bristles passed over a rough place in the board. They entered the lamplight and hung there for a moment. Tessa stopped with the brush held still. The particles turned slowly, descended, and came to rest near the bottom seam. Then she continued. By the time she reached the fourth side, the gathered dust had formed a narrow, pale line. She brushed the bottom toward the center, keeping the strokes short. When everything lay in one place, she lowered the wooden pan and guided the dust into it with the folded hand cloth. The bin looked plain and clean. Tessa checked the corners, then drew the cloth once along the upper rim. The fifth bin was ready to join the others. She carried the lamp a little higher and read the chalk marks directly above it. There were 2 quantities in this group. The first was clear. The second had been written with a lighter touch, but every figure remained visible. A small letter beside them matched the position of the bin below. Tessa went to the ledger. She opened it where the pencil held her place and added the 5th entry beneath the others. Empty. Brushed. Sound. In the narrow column beside it, she copied the 2 earlier quantities exactly as they appeared. She compared the first figure with the beam, then the second. Both matched. She placed the small checking dot beside the group and set the pencil down. 5 bins now stood clean along the wall. Tessa closed the ledger halfway to keep its pages away from the remaining work. She left it beneath the lamp and turned toward the canvas sacks. 5 sound sacks rested in the finished row. The remaining loose canvas occupied less floor than before. With each sack removed, the small group had settled lower and spread outward, showing folded corners and softened edges that had previously been hidden. Tessa chose the uppermost sack. It opened with a low rustle. One side had turned inward during storage, so she laid the sack flat and drew the canvas outward with both hands. The cloth felt firm beneath her palms. Its seams held evenly from the mouth to the lower corners. There was no flour gathered inside. She smoothed the center, brought the lower half upward, and folded the sides across. The finished rectangle was slightly wider than the others. Tessa turned it so its long edge followed the wall and placed it at the end of the row. She added 1 mark to the ledger. 6 sound sacks. The next sack was made from the same heavy canvas, though years of use had softened the weave. When Tessa lifted it, the cloth fell open more readily. Its lower corners settled flat against the boards without being pressed. She checked the seams. Along one side, the stitching had been reinforced with a second line of thread. The repair was old and firm. Tessa ran her fingertips over it, feeling the small raised path beneath the canvas. Nothing had loosened, and no gap opened when she spread the cloth gently. The sack was sound. She folded it with the reinforced seam inside, where it would rest without catching against the neighboring canvas. Then she laid it beside the 6th. 7. The row had begun to show the simple differences between sacks that served the same purpose. One was a shade lighter, another had a softened corner. The newest looking held a sharper crease, while the well-used sack with the reinforced seam rested more loosely in its fold. All were clean enough for continued use. All were sound. Tessa marked the 7th and returned to the bins. The 6th lid opened with a soft wooden knock as it came to rest against the wall. This bin was shallower than the 5th and held only a faint dusting on the bottom. The upper sides were almost clear. Tessa brushed them anyway. She followed the same complete path around the interior. Beginning at the rim meant she would not have to wonder whether a narrow ledge or corner had been overlooked, simply because it appeared clean. The brush passed over every board, gathering what little dust remained. Her movements had grown slower, but not from tiredness. The work no longer required decisions. The clean row had established the method. She could give each stroke its full length, pause when dust entered the light, and let the next movement begin when the air was clear. She gathered the small amount from the bottom and wiped the rim. Above the 6th bin, the chalk group contained 3 quantities. One line had been written smaller than the other 2, perhaps to fit between an older figure and the edge of the beam. Tessa copied it at the same place in the order. She did not change its size in the ledger, or try to decide when it had been added. The quantities were useful as a record, and their position beneath the bin entry preserved everything the loft could plainly tell her. She checked the figures, then she wrote the familiar words for the bin: empty, brushed, sound. The phrase had become a steady line down the page. Tessa looked along it from the first entry to the 6th. Each bin had its earlier quantities beside it. Space remained for the clean grain and its new label. When that grain arrived, the added information would describe the loft as it was now, while the copied figures would remain clearly separate as records from previous harvests. Nothing on the page had to carry more meaning than that. She went back to the canvas. The 8th sack held a fine trace of flour along one inner fold. Tessa opened it near the shallow pan and used the soft brush to draw the flour out. The pale dust gathered beside what she had removed from the 6th bin. She inspected the sack from top to bottom. The mouth was firm. The side seams were close. The lower corners had no thinning or parted thread. She spread it on the boards and smoothed the fold where the flour had rested. The canvas gave beneath her palms and lay flat. Lower half upward, first side inward, second side across. She pressed out the small pocket of air and carried the folded sack to the row. 8 sound sacks. Only 2 remained in the loose group. Tessa lifted the 9th. It was already folded into a long, uneven shape, and when she opened it, she found that one side had simply slipped during storage. The sack itself was clean. She checked its seams, refolded it into a firm rectangle, and placed it with the others. The last sack lay alone on the boards. With the others removed, there was room around it, and a pale outline in the dust where the group had rested. Tessa would brush that part of the floor later, after the sack was moved and the remaining bins were complete. She opened the final sack. Its canvas was cooler on the side that had lain against the boards. The cloth made a soft rasp as Tessa spread it. She examined the stitching, turned the lower corners between her fingers, and found them firm. A small crease near the mouth held a trace of dust. She wiped it with a clean fold of the hand cloth. Then she smoothed the entire sack, folded it in the same manner as the others, and placed it at the end of the finished row. 10 sound sacks rested beside the wall. Tessa counted them once by their visible edges. 1 through 5 formed the first part of the row. 6 through 10 continued without a break. There was no need to lift or shift them. Each rectangle could be seen plainly, and the ledger agreed with what stood before her. She entered the final mark. 10 sound sacks, inspected and folded. The remaining bins still waited, but the open floor had changed. What had been a loose group of canvas was now a low, orderly row. The boards where the sacks had rested were clear to reach. The path from the stairs to the windows felt broader, though nothing had been removed from the loft. Tessa took the brush to the 7th bin. Its dust had gathered near the front, close to the place where hands had once reached in with a scoop. Faint curves showed on the bottom boards, but they were only marks left by ordinary use. She brushed the sides from the rim downward. The lamp warmed one side of her hands. Cooler air touched the other. Outside, the evening had deepened, and the open window showed little more than the quiet shapes of the yard. The brook remained audible, keeping the same low course beside the mill. Tessa finished the 7th bin, gathered the dust, and copied the quantities above it. 4 figures belonged to this group. The final one was faint, so she brought the lamp nearer without touching the beam. Its outline became clear in the sidelight. She copied what was there, compared the ledger with the chalk, and marked the group as checked. The 8th bin was the last. Its lid had stood partly raised since Tessa's first walk through the loft. She lifted it fully and rested it back. The interior was dry with a pale covering on the bottom and a slightly heavier line in the right corner. She placed the pan beside her. By now, every part of the movement was familiar. The upper rim first. because then the long sideboard beneath it, the corner, the next board. Dust descended ahead of the bristles and gathered below. Tessa worked around the bin, leaving clean wood behind each pass. When she reached the heavier corner, she loosened it a little at a time rather than pressing harder. The flour dust came free. She drew it toward the center with the rest, lowered the pan and collected the final pale line. The cloth passed around the rim once. Tessa leaned closer and looked into each corner. The 8th bin was empty, brushed, and sound. She wrote the words in the ledger. Above it, the last chalk group held 2 quantities and 1 short stroke. Tessa copied all 3 marks exactly. She checked them against the beam, then looked back along the complete record from the first bin to the last. 8 bins. Each cleaned, each sound, each earlier group copied beside the place where it had been written. The chalk remained on the beam, unchanged. Tessa closed the ledger and rested both hands on its cover. The gentle part of the work was complete. No loose sack remained to be inspected. No bin still held its old dust. The marks from previous harvests had moved into the new ledger without being turned into guesses or stories. The loft was ready for its next use. Tessa carried the shallow pan downstairs for the last time that evening. She emptied the flour dust into the waste pail and wiped the pan until no pale line remained inside it. Then she returned to the loft and set the clean pan beside the brush. With the bins finished, she lowered their lids one by one. The wood met softly at each rim. First, second, third. She continued along the wall until all 8 clean interiors were covered. The lids would keep them ready until the small delivery of clean grain was brought up and placed into its labeled bins. Tessa crossed to the patch of floor where the loose sacks had rested. She brushed the pale outlines toward the pan in long, light passes. There was little to gather. Most of the dust had already settled between the boards, and what remained came away without rising. When the floor was clear, she returned the brush to the ledge. The lamp now shone across closed lids, open floor, and 10 folded sacks. Its light reached the old chalk marks above, but the quantities no longer waited for attention. They had been copied and checked. They could remain where earlier working hands had left them. Tessa opened the ledger once more. Beside each bin entry, she drew a short blank line for a label. On the next page, she prepared a simple place for the coming delivery. Grain name, quantity, bin, and date placed. She did not fill in any of it. The grain had not arrived, and the labels would be written only when she could match each name to what stood before her. Blank lines were enough for tonight. They made the next stage clear without pretending it had already happened. Tessa closed the book. She narrowed the second window to match the first. Cooler air still passed gently through the loft, but no canvas edge stirred. The folded sacks remained in their even row, their dry surfaces softened by the low lamplight. For a little while, Tessa stood near the stairs and looked over the room. 8 clean bins waited beneath their lids. 10 sound sacks rested together. The old quantities were safely entered in the ledger. The brush and pan were clean. Fine flour dust descended through the last angled beam of light and settled onto the boards she had left undisturbed beyond the work area. Nothing remained uncertain. When the small delivery came, Tessa would bring the blank labels to the bins, write each grain name and quantity, and place the clean grain where the ledger said it belonged. The loft was ready to receive it. She set the ledger near the stairhead, with the label strings laid across its cover. Then she lowered the lamp flame slightly. Alder Brook continued past the resting wheel. The mill held the coolness of evening in its lower rooms, while the grain loft kept a little warmth in the canvas and wood. Tessa listened until the small sounds of her work had faded completely. The sacks did not shift. The lids remained closed. The chalk marks rested above their copied record. With the room prepared and the next page waiting, Tessa left the clear path open from the stairs to the labeled bins and carried the quiet of the finished round with her toward the work still to come. Tessa stood at the stairhead with the ledger beneath one hand. The loft behind her was ready. 8 bin lids rested closed along the wall. 10 canvas sacks lay folded in their low, even row. The old chalk quantities remained on the beam, and the new page held an exact copy of each group beside the bin to which it belonged. On the next page, the blank spaces waited. Grain name, quantity, bin, date, place. Before Tessa could lift the ledger, she heard measured steps cross the yard below. They stopped outside the mill door, followed by one quiet knock against the wood. The expected delivery had arrived. Tessa took the lamp and went downstairs. The main floor felt cooler than the loft. The old boards held less of the day's warmth, and a faint coolness rose from the wheel room below. Alder Brook continued beyond the wall. The wheel remained still. She crossed to the door and opened it. An unnamed local delivery person stood outside with 3 modest, closed bags of grain. Each bag had a plain temporary note tied at the mouth. Together they made a small delivery, already measured and prepared for the loft. 3 bags, as arranged. Tessa thanked the delivery person and held the door while the bags were set, just inside. There was nothing else to settle. The delivery person turned back across the yard, and the sound of the departing steps soon joined the softer sound of the brook. Tessa closed the mill door. She moved the 3 bags beside the work table, keeping the path to the stairs clear. She could have carried them directly into the loft, but the prepared page still needed to be filled, and the labels had to agree with the temporary notes before any grain was placed. The bags were smaller than the canvas sacks upstairs, and light enough for Tessa to carry one at a time without strain. The grain inside was clean and dry. Tessa set the lamp on the work table. She read the first note, then the second and third. 2 bags held the same grain and could share one bin. The third held a different grain in a smaller quantity. There was no need to open anything downstairs. She would carry each bag to the loft, read its note again beneath the lamp, and place it only after the permanent label and ledger entry agreed. She opened the ledger to the prepared page. Beside the first grain name, she copied the quantity from the temporary note. She entered the second bag on the next line, keeping it separate even though it held the same grain. The third went below them. Then she added the intended bins. The first 2 bags would go into the first bin together. The smaller portion would go into the second. The other 6 bins would remain empty, clean, and closed. Tessa read the entries once from top to bottom. Nothing had been placed yet, so she left the final confirmation marks blank. She took the labels from the loft stairhead and brought them to the table. The stiff cards were plain, each with a short length of string already threaded through one corner. Tessa chose 2. On the first, she wrote the name of the grain in the first 2 bags. Beneath it, she wrote their combined quantity. On the second, she wrote the other grain and its smaller quantity. The chalk moved firmly over the card. She held each label beneath the lamp and checked it against the temporary notes and the ledger. Grain name, quantity, bin. All 3 records matched. Only then did she carry the first bag upstairs. She held it against the front of her coat with both arms. The grain shifted softly inside as she climbed, flowing toward the lower end of the bag with each step. It made a quiet, close sound, different from the dry rasp of empty canvas. At the top, Tessa paused. The return path was clear from the stairs to the bins. No loose sack crossed it. The brush and pan rested together on the ledge. The ledger surface remained free of dust. She carried the bag to the first bin and set it down gently. The bin label lay on top of the ledger for the moment. Tessa did not tie it in place yet. The written quantity described 2 bags together, and only one had reached the loft. She went downstairs for the second. The route was the same. Across the cool main floor, up the wooden stairs, along the clear strip of boards to the first bin. The second bag settled beside the first. Tessa placed both temporary notes where the lamp could reach them, then opened the ledger and compared the quantities again. The two separate entries made the same total written on the permanent label. She lifted the first bin lid. Clean wood showed beneath it. The faint scent of flour dust had almost gone, replaced by dry timber and the cooler air moving through the loft. Tessa leaned over and checked the bottom one last time. Nothing had settled there since she brushed it. She untied the first small bag. The fastening loosened without catching. Tessa folded the mouth outward to keep the string from falling into the bin. Then she tipped the bag slowly. Grain began to pour. It struck the wooden bottom with a soft, steady patter. The first kernels spread in a thin layer, then gathered into a shallow slope. Tessa kept the flow narrow and even, allowing the grain to settle rather than throwing dust upward. The sound filled the nearest part of the loft. It was not loud. It was only fuller than the brushing and folding that had come before, a low rain of clean grain against clean boards. As the bag emptied, it grew lighter in her hands. Tessa raised the lower end a little farther. The last kernel slipped from the fold and joined the rest. She held the bag still. Nothing more fell. Tessa folded the empty bag inward and set it aside. Then she opened the second bag and poured it into the same bin. The new grain ran down the small slope made by the first portion. The surface shifted, leveled, and formed a broader, shallow bed across the bottom. When the last kernels had fallen, Tessa waited for the movement to stop. The grain rested well below the top of the bin. There was plenty of room around it. Nothing pressed against the lid, and the quantity was easy to see. Tessa drew one clean hand lightly over the air above the surface without touching it, checking that no string or scrap of temporary paper had fallen inside. The bin held only grain. She lowered the lid until it rested on the rim. Then she tied the permanent label to the front loop. The card hung flat against the wood, showing the grain name and combined quantity. Tessa opened the ledger. On the two separate delivery lines, she added the date placed and marked the first bin. Beside the earlier inventory entry, she filled the blank label line with the same grain name and total quantity shown on the card. She compared the bin, label, and page. They agreed. The first placement was complete. Tessa carried the two empty delivery bags back toward the stairhead. She folded each loosely, keeping them apart from the 10 sound storage sacks already arranged beside the wall. These lighter bags belonged with the delivery and could be taken downstairs when the work was done. She descended for the third bag. The main floor had grown dim around the lamp. Beyond its circle of light, the machinery stood quiet. The brook moved beside the building with the same even sound it had carried through every part of the loft work. Tessa lifted the final bag. It was the lightest of the three. The grain inside shifted only a little as she settled it into her arms. She took the stairs slowly, placing each foot near the center of the tread. The handrail remained within reach, though she did not need it. At the top, the open route brought her directly to the second bin. She set the bag down and read its temporary note once more. The name matched the permanent label. The quantity matched the ledger. The intended place was the second bin. Tessa raised the lid. The clean interior held the low lamplight without glare. She opened the small bag, folded back its mouth, and poured. This grain made a slightly lighter sound as it fell, but the movement was the same. A narrow stream entered the bin, spread across the bottom, and gathered into a shallow mound. Tessa tipped the last corner carefully until every kernel had left the bag. She waited. The mound eased outward and became still. Tessa checked the interior, lowered the lid, and tied the second label to its loop. She returned to the ledger and completed the final line. Grain name. Quantity. Second bin. Date placed. Beside the second bin's earlier entry, she filled the blank label space. Then she compared the written label with the temporary note for the last time. Everything matched. The temporary notes were no longer needed as working labels, but Tessa did not discard them at once. She placed all 3 together inside the back cover of the ledger. They could remain there until the inventory was reviewed at the end of the week. Nothing depended on them now, yet keeping them with the page made the transfer easy to trace. Tessa stood before the row of bins. The first held the 2 abined portions of clean grain. The second held the smaller portion. 6 remained empty. Their lids were closed, and their inventory lines still read as they should. Empty, brushed, and sound. She did not label the empty bins with grain names they did not hold. Instead, she prepared 6 small cards and wrote 1 word on each. Empty. She tied them to the remaining loops in order. The labels made the whole storage row plain at a glance. 2 bins named what they contained. 6 stated that they contained nothing. The ledger gave the same account with the earlier chalk quantities kept in their separate column. Tessa walked from the first bin to the 8th. At each one, she touched the label lightly and read the corresponding line on the page. First bin, grain name and total quantity. Second bin, grain name and smaller quantity. 3rd through 8th, empty. The old quantities remained beside each entry without being confused with the new delivery. Past record and present inventory occupied their own places. At the end of the row, Tessa turned back. The stage of the room had changed. Earlier, the loft had been a place being aired and inspected. Then it had become a room of brushing, folding, and copying. Now it had begun its return to use. The change was modest. Only 2 bins held grain, yet every part of the return had been made visible and exact. Clean grain rested in clean wood. The labels matched the contents. The ledger matched the labels. Nothing had been guessed, and nothing had been left to memory. Tessa gathered the 3 empty delivery bags. She folded them into a loose stack and carried them downstairs. On the main floor, she placed them beside the work table, separate from her work bag. Then she returned once more to the loft. This last climb felt different without grain in her arms. Her steps were lighter, and her hands were free. At the top, she paused where the route opened between the stairhead and the bins. No grain had spilled on the stairs. No kernel lay in the path. She crossed to the first bin and looked along the floor beneath its front edge. Then she checked the second. Both areas were clear. The soft brush remained clean enough to use, but there was nothing to gather. Tessa closed the ledger and tied its cover string. The permanent labels hung still against the bin fronts. Their chalk writing was broad enough to read from the stairhead. Above them, the old beam marks remained pale and quiet in the lamplight. She lowered the flame a little more. The loft had cooled around the newly placed grain. The canvas sacks held their orderly row along the wall, each folded edge visible. The 6 empty bins waited without needing attention. In the 2 filled bins, the grain had finished settling. Tessa listened. There was no sound from inside the bins now. Alder Brook continued outside. The wheel remained at rest beneath the main floor. Cooler air passed through the narrowed windows, touching the room gently without stirring the labels. She carried the ledger to the clear surface near the stairs and laid it flat. Later, after the grain had rested, she could make one final inventory round. She would check the labels, read the page, and confirm that the loft remained dry and orderly. It would not be a new task so much as a quiet return over work already completed. For now, the delivery was fully received. Tessa moved to the windows and drew each one nearly closed, leaving only a narrow space for air. The frames settled into place. The brook sounded a little softer through the smaller openings, though its steady course remained easy to hear. She walked back along the bins. 2 labeled with grain, 6 labeled empty. 10 sound canvas sacks folded beside the wall. 8 groups of earlier quantities copied and checked. At the stairhead, she looked once more across the open floor. The clear route she had used to bring the grain upstairs remained open for the final, unhurried inventory and the settling of the loft for the night. Tessa took up the lamp. Behind her, the clean grain rested in its labeled bins. The flour dust lay settled, and every object in the loft had returned to a plain and dependable place. Tessa held the lamp at the stairhead and looked back across the grain loft. The room had reached the last stage of the evening's work. It no longer needed airing, brushing, folding, copying, or carrying. The delivery had been received. The grain rested in the first 2 bins, and the other 6 stood clean and empty beneath their lids. 10 sound canvas sacks lay in an orderly row along the wall. All that remained was the final inventory round. Tessa set the lamp on the clear surface beside the ledger. Its low flame spread a warm circle over the tied cover, the label strings, and the clean boards nearby. Beyond that light, the loft had grown dim and cool. She rested her hand on the ledger. There was no reason to begin the final round immediately. The grain had only just settled, and the room was still easing from work into rest. Tessa stood quietly and listened. Alder Brook moved beside the mill. Through the narrow openings at the windows, its sound came softly into the loft. It passed under the footbridge, along the mill race, and beyond the resting wheel. There was no turning mechanism beneath the floor tonight, only the continuous water outside and an occasional small answer from the cooling timber. The bins made no sound. The labels hung still. Tessa lifted the lamp and went to the first window. She had left it open by only a narrow space. Cooler air entered there, gentle enough that it did not stir the canvas or make the cards tap against the bin fronts. She placed her fingers near the gap and felt the steady thread of air crossing the frame. The loft was dry. She drew the window closed until the frame rested almost fully in place, leaving a slender opening no wider than her finger. Then she crossed to the other window and did the same. The brook softened a little more. Its sound was still clear, but now it seemed to belong to the building as much as to the yard beyond it. It came through the old walls and around the frames, low, and even beneath the nearer quiet. Tessa returned to the ledger. She untied the cover string and opened the book to the completed inventory page. The lamp stood to her left, where its light fell across the writing without casting the shadow of her hand over it. 8 bin entries filled the first part of the page. Each one began with the same condition recorded during the cleaning: empty, brushed, sound. Beside those words, the first 2 lines now carried the names and quantities of the grain placed that evening. The other 6 remained marked empty. In the narrow column beyond them, the earlier quantities copied from the beam stood separately, each group beside its own bin. Tessa read the first line, then she looked toward the first bin. The permanent label showed the same grain name and the combined quantity from the 2 small delivery bags. The card lay flat against the wood. Its string was secure around the loop, neither tight enough to cut into the card nor loose enough to slip free. She crossed to it. The floor beneath the bin was clear. No kernel had rolled under the front edge. The lid rested evenly on the rim. Tessa placed one palm lightly on the wood and waited. Nothing shifted beneath it. The grain had finished settling. She lifted the lid only far enough to look inside. Lamplight reached over the rim and touched the shallow bed of grain at the bottom. The surface was still. A small slope remained where the second bag had poured across the first, but most of the kernels had eased into an even layer. Tessa did not disturb them. She checked the inner sides of the bin. Nothing clung to the boards above the grain. No piece of string or paper had fallen inside. The clean grain rested alone in clean wood well below the lid. She lowered the cover gently. Wood met wood with a soft, finished sound. At the ledger, Tessa placed a small confirmation mark beside the first bin's present inventory. She had already recorded the delivery when it was placed. This mark meant only that the label, contents, and page had been checked after settling. She moved to the second bin. Its card showed the other grain and the smaller quantity. The string held neatly. The floor beneath was clear, and the lid rested squarely. Tessa raised it a little. The grain inside formed a shallower layer than in the first bin. Its surface caught a narrow band of lamplight and then faded into the soft shadow beneath the rim. The kernels were dry and still. Nothing else lay among them. She closed the lid. The second confirmation mark went beside the second line. 2 filled bins checked. The remaining 6 required less attention, but Tessa gave each one the same unhurried notice. She began with the third. Its card read empty. She touched the label, checked its string, and lifted the lid. The brushed boards inside remained plain and clean. A few particles of flour dust had settled through the room since she closed it, but none had gathered in the bin. The interior held only dry wood and the faint scent left by long use. Tessa lowered the lid. The fourth bin was the same. Empty label, secure string, clean boards beneath the cover. She did not open the lids wide. A narrow view was enough to confirm what the ledger already stated. The bins had been carefully brushed, and no work since then had brought dust near their interiors. At the fifth bin, Tessa paused beneath the beam. The old chalk quantities above it were visible in the side of the lamplight. Their raised edges made slight shadows on the wood. She glanced from those marks to the copied group in the ledger. The figures matched. They remained what they had always been. Quantities written during earlier harvests, arranged above the storage spaces to which they belonged. Copying them had preserved their useful order. It had not turned them into a hidden account or asked them to explain anything beyond themselves. Tessa closed the fifth lid. She continued along the row. The sixth bin stood empty and clean. The seventh stood empty and clean. The eighth, at the end of the wall, stood empty and clean as well. Each label said so plainly. Each corresponding ledger line agreed. The lids rested evenly. The strings were secure, and the floor below remained free of spilled grain. Tessa returned to the book and marked the completion of the round. 2 bins filled and labeled. 6 bins empty and labeled. 8 bin interiors sound. The earlier quantities copied and checked. She set down the pencil. The inventory was clear enough that another person could enter the loft, open the ledger, and understand the room without asking Tessa to remember anything for them. The page said what was present, where it rested, and how much had been placed. It also kept the older chalk record in its own column, distinct from the grain now in storage. That was all an inventory needed to do. Tessa turned to the canvas sacks. The 10 folded rectangles lay where she had arranged them. Their edges formed a low line beside the wall, leaving the route between the stairhead and the bins open. The different shades of canvas showed gently in the lamplight: warm tan, faded cream, and the slightly deeper color of cloth that had spent more time folded away from the sun. She counted the visible edges again. 1, 2, 3. She continued to 10 without touching them. The repaired seam on the 7th sack remained folded inward, protected between layers. The wider 6th sack rested with its long edge along the wall. No corner had lifted since Tessa narrowed the windows. She wrote no new mark for them. The ledger already held the exact count and the result of the inspection. 10 sound sacks, folded. The row itself confirmed the entry. Tessa carried the lamp closer. Its light traveled over the canvas, showing the firm weave and softened creases. Flour dust lay on none of the upper surfaces. The sacks had been opened, checked, wiped where needed, and folded only after their seams proved sound. They were ready for ordinary use. For tonight, readiness meant rest. Tessa returned the lamp to the clear surface near the stairs. She folded the temporary delivery notes together inside the back cover of the ledger, where she had placed them after emptying the bags. They matched the permanent entries and were no longer needed for the room itself, but keeping them with the book until the end-of-week review left the short path of the delivery complete. 3 bags had arrived. 2 had held the same grain and gone into the first bin. One had held the smaller portion of another grain and gone into the second. The delivery bags themselves rested downstairs beside the work table, separate from the 10 storage sacks in the loft. Nothing had been mixed. Tessa closed the ledger and tied the cover string. She did not pull the knot tight. A simple bow held the book closed and could be opened easily when the inventory was next needed. She placed the pencil beside it and returned the wrapped chalk to her work bag. The blank labels that remained were gathered into a small stack. Tessa tied their strings loosely together so they would not spread across the surface. She set them beside the ledger, ready for any later delivery without assigning them names in advance. Then she looked at the tools. The soft brush lay on the ledge beside the shallow wooden pan. Both were clean from the final round of brushing. The handcloth had gathered pale traces of flour in several folds, so Tessa separated it from the clean tools and placed it in her work bag to take downstairs. She carried the brush and pan to the clear surface. The brush rested across the pan without bending its bristles. Beside them lay the tied ledger, the pencil, and the unused labels. Nothing blocked the stairs or the path to the bins. Tessa walked once around the open floor. She moved slowly, not searching for a problem, only seeing the room from each side before leaving it to the night. Near the sacks, the boards were clear where the loose canvas had once rested. Near the bins, no grain lay beneath the labels. The old chalk marks remained untouched on the beam. At the windows, the narrow openings allowed a little air without making a draft. The lamp's glow reached across the center of the loft and thinned toward the walls. In that gentler light, the straight edges of the lids softened. The sacks seemed lower and heavier in their folds, though their weight had not changed. Fine dust that had remained in the air descended almost too slowly to follow. Tessa stood still. One particle passed through the lamplight, turned once, and settled on the floor. Another followed. There was no need to brush them away. They were the last ordinary dust of the room, no longer being stirred by canvas, footsteps, or grain poured into wood. By morning, they would lie quietly on the boards, away from the closed bins and folded sacks. The loft had cooled fully now. When Tessa first arrived, stored warmth had pressed gently around her face and hands. Fresh air had eased it from the room while she inspected the bins. The lamp had then made small warm places beside each task. Now the air felt even from the windows to the stairs. The canvas still held a faint warmth where it lay in layered folds. The bin lids felt cool beneath her fingertips. The grain inside them would remain dry through the night. Tessa picked up the lamp and lowered the flame another small amount. The room did not disappear. The beam, bins, sacks, and ledger remained visible, but their outlines settled into softer shades of brown and gold. Nothing needed bright light now that the work was complete. She carried the lamp to the first bin and began one final walk along the row. She did not open the lids again. At the first, she read the label. At the second, she did the same. At each of the next 6, she read the single word empty. The repetition was steady and uncomplicated. Grain, grain, empty, 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 empty. At the end of the row, she turned toward the sacks. 10 folded. At the beam, 8 groups copied. At the clear surface, ledger closed, labels gathered, brush and pan clean. Every part of the loft agreed with every other part. Tessa returned to the windows. She tested each frame with a light touch. Neither moved. The narrow spaces she had left were enough for the room to breathe, and the night air came through without chilling the stored grain. Beyond the glass, the yard had become a set of calm shapes. The kitchen garden lay low between the mill and the buildings farther back. The bakehouse stood dark. The orchard branches were still against the night sky. Tessa did not need to go there. Those places belonged to other evenings and other useful tasks. Tonight belonged to the grain loft. She stepped away from the window. Alder Brook continued on its course. The sound had been present before she crossed the footbridge and would remain after she left the room. Water passed the mill while the wheel rested. The building held the quiet without becoming empty. Tessa went to the stairhead. Cool air rose faintly from the main floor below. The work table waited there with the 3 folded delivery bags beside it. Her work bag could be carried down, and the lamp would show the stairs clearly. After that, she would close the mill for the night. Before descending, she looked back once more. The first 2 bins held the small delivery of clean grain beneath their labeled lids. The other 6 were ready for whatever later portion might properly belong in them. 10 sound canvas sacks rested in their row. The ledger held the present inventory and the copied quantities from previous harvests, with no guesswork between them. No question remained in the room. The chalk marks had been understood. The sacks had been counted. The bins had been cleaned. The grain had been placed. Tessa lifted her work bag and began down the stairs. Her steps were quiet on the boards. One hand held the lamp, and the other kept the bag close at her side. At the bottom, she set the lamp on the work table and placed the used handcloth with the folded delivery bags. The main floor was cool and still. Above her, the loft gave one soft creak as the timber settled. Then the sound faded into the brook. Tessa stood beneath the stairs and listened. There was no movement from the stored grain, no shifting canvas, and no loose window tapping in its frame. The loft had accepted the new order without strain. It was simply a working room again, prepared for the small community milling day and resting until it was needed. She gathered the delivery bags beneath one arm and took up her work bag. The lamp remained on the table while she made a last round of the main floor. The machinery stood untouched. The route to the door was clear. Nothing from the loft work had been left on the boards. At the doorway, Tessa turned down the lamp. Darkness settled gently through the mill, softened by the faint night light at the windows. She opened the door, stepped into the yard, and drew it closed behind her. The key turned once. Alder Brook sounded clearer outside. Tessa stood for a moment with the folded bags under her arm, and the ledger's finished order held securely in the room above. The mill walls had lost the last warmth of day. Beyond them, the loft cooled around closed bins, labeled grain and resting canvas. She crossed the yard at an easy pace. Behind her, nothing called her back. The final inventory was complete, and the mill could keep it through the night. At the footbridge, Tessa paused only long enough to hear the water beneath the boards. Then she continued along the lane, leaving the grain loft settled, dry, and quiet, ready for the next evening's work.